There's a version of small business ownership that looks almost irresistible on Instagram. A warm, plant-filled cafe, trays of cakes in the window, a queue out the door on a Saturday morning. It looks like the dream. Low tech, low barrier, built on something people genuinely love. Here's the reality behind that photo. In 2026 alone, at least 9 well-known UK bakery businesses have closed, entered liquidation, or gone into administration. One of them, Brown's Original Banbury Cakes, had been trading since the early 1600s. It survived plagues, wars, and the entire Industrial Revolution, and it still didn't survive 2026. Routledge's, a 109-year-old Carlisle bakery chain, went into liquidation, citing a single year's cost increase of over £80,000. Across UK hospitality as a whole, roughly 3,400 businesses go insolvent every single year now, and yet cake cafes keep opening. New ones appear on high streets every month, often started by someone who's never run a business before, funded by savings, a redundancy payout, or a second mortgage. So by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what it costs to open one, where the profit is genuinely supposed to come from, why the margin on a cake cafe is thinner than almost anyone expects going in, and why 2026 in particular has become one of the hardest years in a decade to make this business work. Cake cafe sounds like one business. It's really three, and which one you're running changes almost everything downstream. The coffee-led cafe, with cake as a side attraction. Coffee and drinks are the main margin driver. Cakes and pastries sit in the counter as an add-on, often bought in from a wholesale supplier rather than baked on site. High volume, fast turnover. Thinner staffing needs per item sold. The bakery-led cafe. Cakes and baked goods are the actual product. Coffee is the add-on. This means a kitchen, baking equipment, a skilled baker on the payroll, ingredient costs that fluctuate with flour, butter, sugar and egg prices, and much more labour-intensive production per item. The hybrid brunch and cake concept. Table service, a fuller food menu, cakes as the visual centrepiece and social media draw. This model tends to have the highest revenue per customer, but also the highest staffing costs and the most complex operation to run consistently. A useful way to think about the difference, a coffee-led kiosk and a full brunch spot with table service might both call themselves a cafe, but their cost structures look nothing alike. The kiosk can survive on a tiny footprint and skeleton staff. The brunch concept needs a much bigger revenue base, just to cover its heavier fixed costs. Most people picture the third model when they dream about opening a cake cafe. Most people who actually succeed financially are running something closer to the first. UK startup costs for an independent, owner-operated cafe concept typically run somewhere between £150,000 and £300,000. That figure covers the fit-out, kitchen equipment, the initial rent deposit, and roughly 3 months of working capital to get through the opening period before the business has found its rhythm. That range assumes a relatively standard cafe. A full casual dining concept with table service and a larger kitchen build can roughly double that number. A fine dining adjacent concept goes even higher. Where does that money actually go? Fit-out and kitchen equipment are usually the single biggest line. Commercial ovens, refrigeration, extraction systems, seating, counters, and the front-of-house design that makes the space photogenic enough to compete on social media in the first place. Then there's the lease deposit, typically several months' rent held up front. Then licensing, food hygiene registration, and if you're serving alcohol, a premises license on top. And finally, working capital. Enough cash to cover payroll, rent and suppliers for the first few months while the customer base is still building because very few cafes are profitable from week one. This is the part first-time owners consistently underestimate. The business can be fully built, fully staffed and open on day one, and it can still take months to become cash flow positive, during which every one of those fixed costs keeps running regardless of how many customers walk through the door. Here's the number that matters most in this business: your food cost percentage. If a slice of cake costs you 30% of its selling price in ingredients, your gross profit margin on that item is 70%. If ingredient costs rise and it now costs 35%, your margin drops to 65%. That sounds like a small shift. Multiplied across every item on the menu, every day, it's the difference between a cafe that works and one that doesn't. But gross margin isn't the number that decides whether the business survives. Net margin is. Net profit is what's left after everything: wages, rent, energy, business rates, card payment fees, insurance, accountancy, repairs, cleaning, software, all of it. And here's the uncomfortable truth the industry itself points to. You can have a 70% gross margin on your cakes and coffee and still lose money overall, because the gap between gross and net is where most cafes quietly fail. In 2026, the average UK cafe net margin sits somewhere between 5% and 12%, with most independents landing in the middle of that range. For comparison, the broader UK hospitality sector's long-run average net margin is often cited around 3% to 9%, meaning a cake cafe, done well, can outperform a typical restaurant, but it's still an inherently thin margin business by any normal standard. A retail business or a professional services firm running at 5 to 12% net margin would be considered fragile. In hospitality, it's simply normal. That means the entire business is balanced on a knife edge, where even small cost increases. One supplier price rise here, one wage increase there, can wipe out most or all of the profit in a single quarter. This is where the story sharpens. Several cost pressures didn't just rise gradually in 2026, they landed at almost the same time. Wages. The national living wage rose to £12.71 an hour from 1st April 2026, up from £12.21 the year before. For one full-time staff member working 37.5 hours a week, that's an extra £18.75 a week, around £975 a year per person. A cafe with 3 staff at that wage level is looking at roughly £2,900 in additional annual wage costs just from that single change, before employer national insurance contributions on those higher wages push the real figure higher still. Business rates. The 2026 revaluation hit hospitality particularly hard, especially in town centres that had only just recovered footfall since the pandemic. Plenty of independents are now paying 20% to 40% more in business rates than they were the year before. And unlike wages or ingredient costs, rates are a fixed cost that doesn't flex down in a quiet month. Energy. Energy has moved from being a background expense to what industry consultants now call a strategic consideration in its own right. Cafes run ovens, refrigeration, and lighting continuously from early morning prep through to evening close, and even small inefficiencies compound into significant monthly costs. Crucially, there's no equivalent of the domestic energy price cap for businesses. A Michelin-starred chef publicly described one of his own energy quotes rising 600% during a previous price spike, a stark illustration of how exposed hospitality energy contracts can be compared to household bills. Ingredients: flour, butter, sugar, and eggs, the core inputs of a cake cafe specifically, have all seen sustained price volatility. Many operators haven't revisited their menu pricing since before the period of elevated input costs that began in 2022 and 2023, meaning a coffee or cake priced against yesterday's ingredient costs can now cost more to make than it earns at the till. Put a rough number on it. If wage and cost increases add up to around £3,000 a year for a small cafe, and the business is running on a 10 to 15% net margin, that single cost increase requires somewhere between £20,000 and £30,000 in additional revenue just to stand still, not to grow, just to stay exactly as profitable as it was the year before. 2 scenarios, real numbers. Scenario 1, a coffee-led cafe with bought-in cakes in a mid-sized UK town. Startup cost around £150,000 to £200,000, covering a smaller fit-out and simpler kitchen requirements since cakes are delivered rather than baked on site. Running on a leaner staff structure, this model can realistically target the higher end of the UK average net margin range, 10% to 12%, because it avoids the wastage risk and skilled labour cost of an in-house bakery. The trade-off? It competes on volume and speed, in a market where a chain coffee shop 2 doors down can often match it on price. Scenario 2. A bakery-led cake cafe, baking on-site with a dedicated pastry chef. Startup cost closer to £250,000 to £300,000, driven by the commercial baking equipment and the higher skilled staff needed to produce the product. This model can command a real premium, where customers pay more for visibly fresh, on-site baking, but it also carries the highest exposure to the exact cost pressures covered earlier. Butter, flour, sugar and egg price volatility, unsold stock wastage, and a skilled baker's wage sitting well above minimum wage roles. Net margin here can range anywhere from a strong double digits in a well-run, well-located cafe down to break even, or a loss the moment 2 or 3 of 2026's cost pressures land in the same quarter. Precisely what happened to several of the established names that closed this year. If you want to understand how the economics really work behind the businesses you walk past every day, the pharmacy, the dentist, the cafe, the chippy, hit subscribe. Every week we open up another one.